John, thank you so very much for that very engaged, interesting, and I think important talk. The reason I was on the edge of my seat is because I was so into what you were saying. I consider myself a climate change zealot, and so I just want you to know that I think your message today, your presentation, is the most effective I've ever seen. Concise, clear on what the world is facing due to the effects of climate change. And I think we've got a new vocabulary. I'm taking global warming out of my vocabulary from now on. Dr. Holdren has graciously agreed to respond to questions if you have some, and we have microphones, so if you would make your way to one of the microphones, introduce yourself and ask the question, and while people are going, I will just ask the first question. John, your presentation is so, in some ways, simple and compelling. Simple, I mean that it's concise, the graphs are so clear, that it makes me wonder. I realize it would be difficult to get congressional leaders all in one room to hear this presentation, but I just wonder if it has been given thought of bringing the congressional staffers together. I mean, these are people that are intelligent, and when they see this kind of information, it's hard to imagine that they couldn't be some influence on their bosses. Another thought I had was, what about the Business Roundtable or some of our most important corporate leaders? Again, I think in 30 minutes, they would see a presentation that I think is just very, very difficult to refute. So I just wonder if there was any sort of, probably there has been, but are there any communication, educational strategies for groups that could influence actions taken by Congress?
Well, thanks for those questions. I have actually given earlier versions of this presentation to the Business Roundtable. The Business Roundtable actually changed its position on climate change between 1997 and 2002. In part, it wasn't just my presentation, but they actually listened to a lot of presentations from climate change scientists. And they actually ran some ads for a while saying it's time to take action on climate change. I've given a version of this presentation to several annual meetings assembled by CERES, the Council for Environmentally Responsible Economies, which brought together the last time money managers who altogether were responsible for managing $8 trillion in assets. I have given the presentation to many groups of senators and members of Congress and to staffs, and I'll keep doing that. Good. But it's interesting, and this is one of the challenges of communication, it doesn't work as instantly as you might hope. It often causes people to come up to me and say, you've made me think more about this, would you send me some more information? I have provided a lot of that information to senators who've asked for it, to members who've asked for it, staffs who've asked for it, and we'll keep doing that. There are a lot of folks out there giving talks very much like this, and we are reaching those audiences, and I think we are having an effect. The proportion of the American public who now believe that climate change is either a serious or very serious problem is up in the range of 70 to 75%, depending on exactly how the question are asked. It's a little bit lower than that in the Congress, but it's that high in the public. And as I told the president one day when we were talking about this, I said, Mr. President, you know, that's 25% larger than the percentage of Americans who believe evolution is a fact. And the president looked at me and he said, that's no consolation.
Let's start over here. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Dan Kirk-Davidoff. I'm Chief Scientist for Weather and Climate Services at MDA Information System and an adjunct here at Maryland. I was looking at your first couple of slides. I've spent a lot of time since being in the private sector having, I do some climate science consulting, and I spent a lot of time having arguments with sort of the skeptic community. And I mean, I guess my feeling after endless back and forth emails on this, is that it's driven, a lot of the skepticism is driven by anxiety about the remedies. You know, and once you're anxious enough about the remedies, once you're ideologically very committed to being very afraid of a carbon tax or whatever else people are, all the remedies people talk about, and you're a smart person, then, you know, game over. You can spend the rest of your life arguing with everyone. I mean, I've seen the arguments about every single graph that you put up there, and it's a morass. You can spend hours and hours arguing about every single one, and the people who are ideologically committed will just never give up. And so I guess I want to say I was very pleased with this stuff you put up about mitigation, but I guess I wanted to ask, the question that I would ask is, what kinds of scenarios of mitigation strategies, what ways of presenting mitigation strategies can we all talk about that would tend to reduce anxiety? I mean, I would suggest, my thought would be examples of successful mitigation, but I'll leave it at that and stop talking.
Yeah, well, I mean, your first observations are very perceptive, of course. You're absolutely right. A lot of the skepticism comes from the basic proposition, this better not be true because the remedies would be so awful that we just have to hope and believe it's not true, that we need to embrace those remedies. And that does make it very important to spend some time on the remedies and the proposition that they are not unmanageable and intolerably costly. And in ordinary talks, which you'll be horrified to learn are much longer than this one that I give, I spend more time on the remedies. There's very good scenario work going on in a lot of places, including in the Joint Center here at the University of Maryland with Battelle on climate change. And Jay Edmonds and his colleagues there have really done some fabulous work on spinning out what these different trajectories could look like and what the investments required would likely be. And they're challenging, but they're manageable. One of the things that most frustrates me about communication on this is the assumption that whatever it costs is somehow a dead loss to society. Whereas in fact what it is, it's a choice about how society spends its resources. We spend large amounts of money on national defense, and nobody's out there saying this is a dead loss to society. National defense creates jobs, employment, new technologies. Addressing this challenge to our security would also create jobs, innovation, employment, new businesses. Again, and particularly I would say in a high unemployment economy, the notion that investing in stabilizing the climate under which we all live would be a rather attractive proposition. But one does have to tell the story in those ways. And it's a real tension between how much time you spend convincing people there's a problem and how much time you spend convincing them there's a solution. If you start too much on the solutions before they believe there's a problem, they're tuning you out. On the other hand, as you point out, if you spend too much time telling them about the problem without explaining that there's a solution, they turn against the proposition that there's a problem. So,
you know, John, I think the parallel with defense is a very interesting one, because during times of peace, we invest in defense as a prudent measure. And sort of looking at this issue as an investment as a form of prudence,
right,
is, I think, a powerful approach. Let's go over to Freeman.
Hi, Jack. Great presentation for anybody who has basic knowledge of science, who's not bothered or intimidated by charts, and who can think as about $1 trillion per year. And so I enjoyed it. However, and I have to say this, this is an audience of educated people, I would simply say that I was thinking about just people in a normal community, some of whom may have a college degree, most don't like math and science. There were a few charts where they would get it, but in many charts they'd be frightened by quite frankly, just the science and what it means, and it sounds to them like scientists talking to scientists. And I would simply say that while 75% of Americans might believe that there's some problem here, I don't think they really get it. I'm not sure they fully appreciate the nuances that are there. And so I'm simply saying, as a country, as a world, we have a challenge of figuring out ways of making it real. I mean, it was very interesting. You talk about the impact on seafood or on shells, and all of a sudden Shirley Malcolm said something about crabs. If something had an impact on crabs in Maryland, Maryland would get it. We'd vote for whatever, you know. If we saw that we weren't going to be able to get our crab meat, we'd be really bothered, all right? And I just think we need people who can help us think about what brings it to the gut, particularly not just the problem, but what we can do to make sure we have the kind of life we want to have. Just a thought.
Thank you. I'm going to make up a crab slide right when I get back to my office. No, I do also want to assure you that I have different versions of this talk for different levels of audience sophistication. I wouldn't impose on the Rotary Club quite the level of sophistication here.
Hi, I'm Ray Hoff from UMBC. I was taken with your slide about environment and the environment and the economy, because it's always framed in environment or the economy. And you know, I've worked in the environment for 40 years, so I'm used to being on the losing side. I also root for the Orioles. But could you say a few words about the Keystone Pipeline decision that's currently being examined by the White House, and how you could possibly frame that as being a positive part of your message on climate?
Well, I knew I'd get a really tough one eventually. I mean, first of all, let me say that I think in a great many domains, it really isn't economy versus the environment. It's economy and the environment. And what we have to figure out is how to advance our economic and environmental interests in sync. The Keystone Pipeline issue, I suppose everybody in the room knows the Keystone Pipeline is a pipeline that will run from Canada to the Gulf Coast if it's built, carrying oil from the Canadian tar sands to be refined on the Gulf. And the arguments for it are that the United States depending on Canadian oil is better than depending on Middle East and Venezuelan oil, that building the pipeline will create lots of jobs, and that the safety has been very carefully studied and can be assured. The arguments against it are that the Canadian tar sands are one of the a very substantial reservoir of carbon, which either will or won't be added to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. That if we really mean to take the climate change issue seriously, we will be moving away from those fossil carbon-based sources, except where we plan to employ technology that can capture the CO2 and sequester it away from the atmosphere, and that that the safety issues are more complex than has been advertised, and assurances of safety are always less than fully reliable. So those are the arguments on either side. Those arguments are now actually being weighed by the Secretary of State. The way the process goes, the decision doesn't go to the President unless the Secretary of State refers it to him. And that generally happens if one or more agencies which have stakes in this domain object to some part of the Secretary of State's national interest determination, which has not happened yet. My own expectation is that this is an important enough issue that the President will be looking at it and working with the Secretary of State and thinking about this national interest determination. I can't predict how it will come out in this environment because it's complicated. It is one of those issues where unavoidably, to some extent, environment and economy come into conflict. But I certainly wouldn't discourage anybody in this room from making your views known on which side of this issue you come down on.